My aunt always embarrassed me in front of the family, so I let her own words come back to her. Growing up, I always believed family was supposed to be the one place where you felt accepted, even if the rest of the world didn't understand you. My parents weren't rich, but they worked hard, and they taught me to respect people no matter what they had or where they came from. Unfortunately, not everyone in my family shared those values. My Aunt Melissa had a strange obsession with putting people down, especially if she thought it would make her look smarter or more successful. She had this talent for disguising insults as jokes, and somehow everyone else would laugh while I sat there wondering why I was always the punchline. Every birthday party, every holiday dinner, every family barbecue, it never failed. She would find a way to embarrass me. If I got a haircut, she'd ask if the barber had lost a bet. If I wore a new outfit, she'd say I looked like I got dressed in the dark. If I stayed quiet, she'd call me awkward. If I talked too much, she'd say I was desperate for attention. No matter what I did, she'd twist it into something to laugh about, and every time someone chuckled, it felt like another reminder that nobody was going to stand up for me. At first, I assumed it would stop when I got older. Kids get teased, right? Adults don't keep acting like that. I couldn't have been more wrong. As I entered my 20s, her comments only became more personal. She started comparing me to my cousins, who all seemed to have their lives perfectly together. One had just graduated from university. Another had landed an impressive corporate job. One had recently gotten engaged. Then there was me, still trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life while working a regular retail job to pay my bills. Every family gathering turned into another opportunity for her to remind everyone that I wasn't where she thought I should be. Maybe next year he'll finally have a real career, she'd laugh while sipping her wine. Everyone would smile awkwardly, and I'd force a fake grin because arguing would only make things worse. Inside, though, every comment stayed with me far longer than she probably realized. The worst part wasn't even the insults. It was the way she'd immediately follow them with, "Oh, relax, I'm only joking." I started to hate those 4 words. Somehow, they magically erased any responsibility for what she'd just said. If I looked upset, suddenly I was the sensitive one. If I defended myself, I couldn't take a joke. It became a game I could never win. My parents noticed I was quieter after every family event, but they always told me to ignore her because that's just how Melissa is. I hated that excuse. Imagine treating someone badly for years and having everyone accept it simply because that's your personality. Nobody ever expected her to change. They expected everyone else to tolerate it. One Thanksgiving stands out more than any other. Nearly 20 family members had gathered around my grandparents' dining table. The conversation was light until someone asked me how work was going. Before I could answer, Aunt Melissa jumped in. "Oh, he's still working that little store job. Maybe if he spent less time dreaming and more time working, he'd finally become successful." A few people laughed nervously while others stared down at their plates. I remember gripping my fork so tightly my hand hurt. My face felt hot and I wanted nothing more than to disappear. Then she added, "At least someone has to keep the shopping malls running." She laughed at her own joke harder than anyone else. That was the moment I realized she genuinely enjoyed humiliating people. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't harmless. She liked having an audience. That night I drove home replaying every word she'd ever said to me. I realized something that honestly scared me. I had started believing her. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone who wasn't good enough. Every time I applied for a better job, I expected rejection before I even hit submit. I wasn't just carrying her insults around anymore. I had turned them into my own inner voice. That realization hurt more than anything she'd ever said out loud. I promised myself something as I sat in my driveway that night. I wasn't going to spend the rest of my life trying to prove her wrong. I was going to build a life that made her opinion completely irrelevant. Over the next year, I stopped talking about my plans with anyone in the family. I enrolled in online courses after work. Every evening while everyone else was watching TV, I was studying. I learned new skills, updated my resume, and started applying for better opportunities without telling a single relative. Whenever there was a family gathering, I still showed up, but I answered every question with the same boring response. "Work's going fine." Nothing more. Aunt Melissa kept fishing for information so she could find something new to criticize, but I stopped giving her ammunition. The funny thing about people who love putting others down is they get frustrated when they can't find anything to attack. Months later, I landed a job that nearly doubled my salary. It wasn't luck. It was hundreds of applications, countless interviews, and a year of teaching myself skills I never thought I could learn. I didn't post about it online. I didn't announce it at family dinner. I quietly accepted the offer and kept living my life. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely proud of myself. Not because I had something to prove, but because I'd achieved something through persistence. Ironically, the less I cared about impressing my family, the more confident I became. Then came my grandmother's 70th birthday celebration. Almost the entire family was there, including Aunt Melissa. As soon as I walked through the door, she looked me up and down with that familiar smirk. "Wow," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "You finally bought clothes that fit. Maybe that little store gave you an employee discount." A few people laughed out of habit, but this time it didn't sting. I simply smiled, grabbed a drink, and joined another conversation. I noticed something strange. She looked disappointed that I hadn't reacted. It was almost like my silence had stolen the fun from her joke. For the rest of the afternoon, she kept trying to get under my skin with little comments, but I ignored every single one. I didn't realize it then, but life was quietly setting the stage for the biggest irony I'd ever witness. And when it happened, I wouldn't have to embarrass her at all. She was about to do it herself, using the very words she'd spent years throwing at everyone else. After my grandmother's birthday, something changed. It wasn't my aunt. She was exactly the same. The difference was me. For years, I'd waited for someone in the family to defend me, but once I stopped expecting that, I stopped giving her the power to ruin my day. Whenever she made another sarcastic comment, I'd simply smile and continue talking to someone else. That seemed to frustrate her more than any argument ever could. People like her didn't just enjoy making jokes, they enjoyed getting a reaction. Without that reaction, her comments just sounded mean. Slowly, I noticed other relatives beginning to look uncomfortable whenever she started talking. It was almost as if they'd never really listened to what she was saying before. Now that I wasn't fighting back, they were hearing her words for what they actually were. A few weeks later, my cousin Daniel invited everyone over to celebrate his promotion. He'd landed a management position at a large company, and honestly, I was happy for him. He'd worked hard for it. The house was packed with family members laughing, eating, and catching up. As expected, Aunt Melissa made herself the center of attention. She walked around telling everyone how proud she was of Daniel, reminding people how she'd always encouraged him to aim high. Listening to her talk, you'd think she'd personally built his career. Every conversation somehow found its way back to her. I stayed mostly quiet, helping in the kitchen and chatting with cousins I hadn't seen in months. Things were actually going well until she spotted me across the room. "There he is," she called out with that familiar grin, still keeping the shopping world alive. A few people glanced toward me. Instead of answering, I simply smiled and shrugged. She frowned for a split second before forcing another laugh. "See, that's why you'll never get ahead. You've got no ambition." I took a sip of my drink and replied calmly, "Actually, I'm happy with how things are going." That answer seemed to bother her more than if I'd argued. She couldn't understand why I wasn't embarrassed anymore. Later that evening, I overheard something interesting. My uncle was quietly talking with my dad in the backyard. Apparently, Aunt Melissa's husband had recently lost a major client at his business. Money wasn't flowing the way it used to, and they'd started cutting back on expenses. I didn't think much of it at the time. Everyone goes through difficult seasons, and despite everything she'd said to me over the years, I genuinely didn't wish financial problems on anyone. I figured they bounce back eventually. Over the next few months, I settled into my new career. The job challenged me every day, but I loved learning new things. I even started saving enough money to move into a nicer apartment. For the first time in my adult life, I felt stable. My confidence came from my own progress instead of other people's approval. Ironically, the less I talked about my achievements, the more curious my relatives became. They noticed I drove a different car. They noticed I seemed happier. They noticed I no longer looked nervous at family gatherings. Aunt Melissa noticed too, and it clearly bothered her. Then one Sunday afternoon, my mom called me. "Did you hear about Melissa?" she asked. I hadn't. Apparently her husband's business had taken another hit, and they were now considering selling their house to cover debts. I felt bad hearing that. Nobody deserves to lose everything they've worked for. My mom sighed and said, "They're under a lot of stress." I told her I hoped things worked out for them. That was the end of the conversation. About a month later, my grandparents announced another family dinner. Almost everyone showed up. The atmosphere felt different the moment I walked in. Aunt Melissa wasn't her usual loud, confident self. She seemed tired. The expensive designer clothes she'd always worn were replaced by something much simpler. She smiled, but it looked forced. During dinner, everyone avoided talking about money or work until one of my younger cousins innocently asked her husband how his business was doing. The room went quiet. He hesitated before admitting things had been difficult. "We're doing our best," he said. "Hopefully things turn around soon." For the first time in years, Aunt Melissa had nothing sarcastic to say. She stared at her plate while the room filled with awkward silence. Then another relative tried to lighten the mood by saying, "Well, tough times don't last forever." Everyone nodded. The conversation slowly moved on, but I could tell Melissa was embarrassed. Not because anyone had insulted her, but because life had humbled her in a way nobody else ever could. As dinner came to an end, everyone gathered in the living room for dessert. My grandfather started telling old stories about when the family had very little money. He laughed about working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table. Then he looked at everyone and said something I'll never forget. "Success can disappear faster than people think. That's why you should never look down on anyone who's still climbing." The room fell completely silent. I glanced toward Aunt Melissa. She slowly lowered her eyes. And then, just a few minutes later, she made one final comment that would change everything. She had no idea those words were about to come back to her in front of the entire family. Everyone was standing around the living room with slices of cake and cups of coffee when my grandfather's words finally settled over the room. Nobody spoke for a few seconds. My aunt forced a smile and tried to change the subject, but it was obvious the mood had shifted. Then my cousin Sarah mentioned that she was thinking about changing careers because she wasn't happy at her current job. Before anyone else could respond, Aunt Melissa laughed and said, "Well, if you're going to make a change, don't end up working some dead-end job. Nobody respects people who settle." The moment those words left her mouth, I saw several people exchange looks. She used almost the exact same line on me countless times over the years. Only this time it landed differently. Her own husband had just admitted they were struggling financially, and everyone in that room knew it. Nobody laughed. Instead, my grandfather quietly looked at her and said, "Melissa, wasn't your husband saying a few minutes ago that any honest job is better than no job at all?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Well, that's different," she replied. My grandfather gently shook his head. "No, it is. Work is work. You've always been quick to judge other people's lives without knowing what they're dealing with." The room became so quiet I could hear the clock ticking on the wall. For the first time in my life, someone had finally challenged her. She looked around the room as if she expected someone to defend her. Nobody did. My dad stayed silent. My mom looked down at her coffee. My cousins avoided eye contact. My aunt's husband let out a long sigh and quietly said, "He's right." That surprised everyone. He rubbed his forehead before continuing. "I've listened to these jokes for years. I never said anything because I thought they were harmless. Looking back, they weren't. A lot of them were cruel." My aunt stared at him in complete disbelief. "You're taking their side?" she asked. He answered calmly, "I'm not taking sides, I'm telling the truth." She turned toward me, almost expecting me to fire back after all these years. Honestly, a younger version of me probably would have. I had imagined that moment hundreds of times. I pictured embarrassing her the way she'd embarrassed me. I pictured making everyone laugh at her expense. But standing there, watching someone who suddenly realized the room was no longer laughing with her, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt something else. Pity. I simply smiled and said, "You know, you used to tell me all the time that if people couldn't handle criticism, they'd never grow. I guess life has a way of teaching all of us something eventually." Those were her own words. I didn't change them. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't insult her. I simply handed her the same lesson she'd spent years handing out to everyone else. She didn't have an answer. She grabbed her handbag and quietly walked outside. Nobody stopped her. After a few minutes, my uncle followed her. The rest of us stayed inside, and for the first time in years, family dinner actually felt peaceful. My grandmother looked at me and said something I'd wanted to hear my entire life. "I'm sorry we didn't stop it sooner." My parents apologized too. My dad admitted that he always thought ignoring the problem would make it disappear. Instead, it allowed it to continue. Hearing those words didn't erase the past, but they helped me let go of it. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Aunt Melissa called me. I almost didn't answer because I assumed she wanted to argue. Instead, there was a long silence before she finally spoke. "I owe you an apology." I honestly didn't know what to say. She admitted she'd spent years putting people down because it made her feel important. As long as someone else looked smaller, she felt bigger. She told me losing money, watching people stop laughing, and hearing her own words repeated back to her made her realize the kind of person she'd become. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She simply said she was sorry. Forgiveness isn't something that happens instantly. It takes time. But I accepted her apology because carrying resentment was only hurting me. That didn't mean we suddenly became best friends. It meant I chose peace over bitterness. From that day forward, our relationship was different. She still had opinions, but she stopped making people the punchline. Family gatherings became something I actually looked forward to instead of something I dreaded. Looking back now, I realized the biggest victory wasn't watching my aunt get embarrassed. The biggest victory was becoming someone who no longer needed revenge to feel whole. If I'd spent years waiting for the perfect comeback, I'd still be living in the past. Instead, I focused on improving my own life, and eventually life created a moment where the truth spoke louder than I ever could. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's that people who constantly humiliate others often end up facing the consequences of their own behavior. You don't have to fight every battle. Sometimes the strongest response is becoming so confident that their words no longer have any power over you. Success isn't making someone else feel small. Real success is growing into someone who doesn't need to. Never let another person's opinion become your identity. The people who criticize you the most often know the least about your journey. Focus on building your life instead of proving people wrong. In time, your actions will speak louder than any argument ever could. Don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories, life lessons, and unforgettable moments.